Can we talk about Albo and transparency? Remember, once upon a time, transparency was Anthony Albanese's favorite word? At least it was when he could use it as a stick to beat the other guy.
We need to have transparency in the process because our system of parliamentary democracy relies upon conventions, relies upon the Westminster system of checks and balances.
Transparency, yes. Well, that was just a few months ago when the Prime Minister was announcing an inquiry into Scott Morrison's secret ministries. And fair enough. But 5 months is a long time in politics. And now, and full credit to the Age newspaper for breaking this story, which suggests that as far as its promises of transparency are concerned, the Albanese government really ought to send the PM out to Costco in C1 so he can pick up a case of Windex. Look, here's what we know on this story. On Saturday, the PM flew to Victoria on his way to visit flood-stricken communities in Western Australia. While in Geelong, he had meetings and did a public event with Defence Minister Richard Marles, took some selfies on the street and, generally did his prime ministerial thing. All fair enough. But then, when he was done there in Geelong, Albo didn't get back on the VIP jet and fang over to WA. No. Instead, he got on a private helicopter owned by billionaire Lindsay Fox and choppered over to the Fox compound by the ocean at Portsea. There, he attended a 5+ hour barbecue at the Fox's beachside shack that was also attended by none other than Victorian Premier Dan Andrews. Now, what was discussed? We don't know. Was the meet and greet in Geelong arranged so that Albo could attend the barbecue? Again, we don't know. But what we do know is that the PM has been awfully reticent when it comes to answering questions about this. When asked about his attendance at this barbecue and the private helicopter ride by a reporter on Wednesday at a press conference in Rockhampton, here's what Albo had to say.
Well, I have private meetings all the time, and I have private meetings which are private meetings.
Well, indeed, and as they say in politics, I trust that this puts an end to the matter. Only it doesn't, because the Age also pointed out that Albo, after the barbecue, got back on that same chopper and flew out to Avalon Airport, also owned by the Foxes, before continuing on his journey. Now, that's a hell of a way to get to net zero there on a helicopter, but what are you going to do? And funnily enough, back in 2017, Albo was on the ABC talking about politicians and entitlements, and he said, in the context of Bronwyn Bishop, quote, "People scratch their heads about why do you get a chopper from Melbourne to Geelong? I scratched my head myself, I've got to say." Well, Melbourne to Geelong, Geelong to Portsea, it's all much of a muchness, isn't it? But of course, that was before Albo was PM and had urgent private barbecues to get to. Coincidentally, notes the Age, quote, "Fox has made no secret of his ambition to develop his company's privately owned airport, Avalon, into an intermodal transport hub that can open up new and more efficient passenger and freight routes between Australia and Southeast Asia. For the family to realize this ambition, it would require assistance from the Victorian and Commonwealth governments." The Age also noted that Fox is very close to Dan Andrews and has been called Andrews' go-to billionaire in the past. Now, no one is saying that anything untoward or underhanded was going on here. Dan Andrews today said they didn't discuss Fox business interests during the event, which is, I suppose, at least a little more than what the PM said. And as long as the PM declares the hospitality on his personal interest register, on one level, there's nothing to see here. Yet on another level, this story really rankles. Remember, Anthony Albanese is very keen, again, to make a big deal about being transparent, but only when it suits him. And when it doesn't, it's a different story. And I'll tell you what, Australia, we can't say we weren't warned about this. Remember back in May, during the campaign, when Albo ran out of a press conference when he was pressed on budget deficits?
Mr Albanese, will your deficit be higher or lower than the current?
I'm sorry, Albo. Yeah, I know. I'll just wait till this madness finishes. Yeah. Do you want to wait a minute, maybe?
It's honestly about that. Isn't there a problem with transparency? We're following you for answers, Mr Albanese, and you're now just not giving them. You have to answer eventually.
So dignified, so prime ministerial, so, dare I say, transparent. And of course, I'm not the only one who thinks that despite the fact that there's something to all of this, that there is something to see here. Have a listen to what Deputy Opposition Leader Susan Ley had to say earlier today.
He also thought it was more important to take a private helicopter flight to a barbecue with a billionaire for 6 hours. What was discussed? What promises were made? What arrangements were made as that barbecue took place? And why has that not been disclosed? And when he was asked about this, the Prime Minister said it was private. But that was disingenuous, because he should have known that all of this has to be disclosed. This gift of a private helicopter ride has to be disclosed. So he always said that transparency and having the people's back and leaving no one behind would have been hallmarks of his prime ministership. And what does this say about his ethics and about his transparency?
Earlier this week, we talked about how the PM seemed to be getting ahead of himself on the issue of the voice, and now it seems like he's getting ahead of himself on other things too. One Canberra insider I talked to today told me that this sort of behaviour was a sign the government was getting too comfortable and, even in his words, too arrogant. And indeed, this is exactly the sort of hospitality that has brought many other politicians to grief. Again, I don't want to make more of this than it is, but if the PM is going to make himself the poster boy for transparency, well, he better start acting like it, lest he be accused of calling for one thing and doing another.